And with Dr. Mike Axelrod, who is the Director of Human Development Center here at UW Eau Claire, and he's also a professor of psychology. And I'm so excited to have you here today, Mike.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so Mike has an exciting new adventure that is out in the world called The Great Myths of Adolescence, which is a really amazing book. I'm super excited to have a discussion with you about it today.
Yeah, sure.
Just before we get into some of what these myths are, how did the idea for this book come about?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Two of my co-authors, Steve Hupp and Jeremy Jewell, wrote Great Myths of Child Development for a rather popular book series called Great Myths of Psychology. And that's edited by Scott Lilienfeld and Steve Lynn. And so this was just a natural extension. They wrote Great Myths of Child Development. It was just a very natural extension. They brought me in on the project. I've done a lot of presentations and clinical work, and I've done research involving adolescence. And they also brought in our other co-author, Mitch Prinstein, who's written a lot and presented a lot on adolescence and particularly popularity. So, so this again was a very natural extension of that series, and of course that Great Myths of Child Development book.
Okay, now I'm guessing, these myths come from somewhere, right? So how do you see this when it unfolds in your daily practice?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that as I think about that question, there's probably two facets. Okay. The first is what parents and educational professionals and mental health professionals sort of think about teenagers and how they are often guided actually by these misconceptions. So there's two myths in particular that sort of come to mind. For parents, the idea, for example, that adolescence is a time in which teenagers are supposed to detach from their parents. And oftentimes that we see a physical detachment. And the assumption is that there's also going to be an emotional detachment. That myth was actually started by Freud, and actually continued by his daughter Anna Freud. What we find is that there's certainly a physical detachment during adolescence. We know that parents see less of their teenager as they go from age of about 12 to 17 or 18, and then if they go to college or go on into the workforce. But what we don't find actually is an emotional detachment. In fact, most teenagers will report a more intimate relationship with their parents as they get older. Rather than sort of a less intimate or, as I said, a detached relationship. So that can certainly affect parenting in terms of what you might expect or how you might respond to teenagers. So we see that. Another one in terms of educators, for example, is the idea that school violence is on the rise. If we look at all the statistics that are available to us, with the exception of the first half of 2018 where we saw a lot of mass shootings at schools. If we exclude that, what we actually find is that school violence, in terms of not just violent crimes, but also sort of the kinds of things we might see in a high school, like fights and thefts and those kinds of things, actually have been on a decline steadily since the 1980s. So you can imagine how educators thinking that school violence is on the rise, and we're seeing that now where schools are becoming fortresses.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing that I think how these myths play out is just society in general. Just our society's view of teenagers. They get a bad rep. And I think that really affects how society interacts with teenagers. We aren't very empathic toward teenagers. We don't respect teenagers. And I think that shows up in terms of some of the things that we see, for example, in the media.
Sure. And I think that's such a two-way street, too. It's right. If they aren't respected, respect needs to go both ways. We're different at different places in our lives. But there's a lot of those types of highlights that I think come from this book, and obviously we'll
actually, I'm glad you said that, because Jeffrey Arnett, who's a developmental researcher and author, and he focuses on adolescence, he wrote the foreword to our book, and one of the points he makes is that adolescence is the real last sort of acceptable prejudice. That it's okay to be prejudiced against adolescence.
Sure.
And so I think that the misconceptions that we present in this book actually perpetuate that.
I would definitely agree with that. So overall, I think this book is an excellent resource.
Thank you.
In many ways. I could see utilizing this book for a variety of audiences. And, if you were to sit down and read this book, you would learn a lot.
Oh, thank you.
If you wanted to use it, for me, I went through, I was like, okay, well, I have a, about to be teenager who, that kind of resonates with me. And to me, it can be used as a one at a time thing, too. I think it's just a really, really excellent resource. And going through this book highlighted some of my own prejudice, which I really had to take a step back from. So that was also a good reminder. But just as an example of one of the myths that I guess I was carrying around would be that all adolescents are going to experience mood disruptions or disorders or heightened mood experiences. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's a good one because that myth can be traced way back to actually a early pioneer in psychology, G. Stanley Hall, who coined the term storm and stress and describing the teenage years. That was back in about 1900.
Wow.
And Anna Freud took that storm and stress idea and promoted it without having any research to back it up. And I think so that's been a myth that's been perpetuated for at least a century now. Yeah. What we find in terms of like public opinion polls is that most adults describe teenagers as moody, and they'll also describe them as depressed, anxious, and irritable. And so what we did in the book is sort of looked at, okay, well that's what how the public perceives adolescence, and that's not surprising, right? Yeah. But what does the research say? And what the research says is that teenagers are no more moody than children or adults, which surprises people. And that teens are actually pretty adept at regulating their mood, which surprises people as well. What we find also is that people believe that the moodiness that teenagers do present with are a result of hormones, and that's actually not true either. Our mood is typically dictated, if you will, or dependent on the activities that we do. And so if you were to follow me around my day, you would find that my mood would fluctuate depending on the kinds of things I was doing. So things that I'd find fun, I'd have a more elevated mood. And the doing paperwork or administrative meetings here at the university, you'd find me during those, my mood would be lower. And so we find that to be true of teenagers and children and adults.
And that makes perfect sense. One of the things that's pointed out in the description of this myth is that the idea that before the age of 13, perhaps emotions are processed in a less, to me, the word awareness comes to mind. That once they sort of reach that, teenage years, it's not so much that they're moodier as it is that they have more recognition of their feelings.
Right. That's a very good point. I think self-awareness is a pretty critical part to this. We know that the adolescent brain is very different than the brain during childhood and the brain during adolescence. For instance, during early adolescence, the limbic system, which is the part of the brain that is really responsible for emotional arousal, that part of the brain is really developing at a pretty rapid pace. Whereas the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for things like organization and planning and abstract thinking, that part of the brain actually slows down in terms of development. So part of it is what we see from teenagers is related to sort of how their brain is developing. But in that context, self-awareness is also developing. And so it's not unusual when as a clinician, as I talk to teenagers, for them to to be very articulate about sort of what they're experiencing emotionally.
Sure.
Although we also have to remember that it's really hard to articulate what's going on internally, even for adults.
Even as adults,
There's a lot of ambiguity in terms of how we speak of our emotions and feelings and behaviors, because they're not always clearly understood to us.
Right.
But one of the things we have to go back and remember is that what teenagers are experiencing in terms of their emotions isn't that much different than what adults might be experiencing in terms of our own emotions.
Sure. We just are more practiced at regulating, controlling socially acceptable patterns of, it's...
And we're allowed to excuse emotional outbursts, right?
Sure.
I mean, we could say, well, I had a bad day at work. That's why when I got home, I was really quick-tempered with my family.
Yeah.
If a teenager came home and said, I had a really bad day at school, that's why I'm acting the way I'm acting, we'd tell them, get over it.
Yeah, tough times.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think we have to be sensitive to that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also some notes in this myth regarding rates of depression and suicide. Could you touch on a little bit of, because there obviously are higher rates of teens diagnosed with depression and committing suicide compared to younger children.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think while the myth that mood disruptions are common in adolescence has been debunked, we can't ignore the fact that there are some teenagers that experience significant mental health issues, and that there are many teenagers that experience problems occasionally across development with mood. And so I think that's something that we have to balance in terms of thinking about teenagers and this particular myth. But when we look at prevalence, we know that teenagers are more at risk for depression and anxiety, and suicide ideation and non-suicidal self-harm like cutting when compared to children.
Sure.
The rates aren't that significantly different than when we compare them to adults.
Right. And I think that's an important consideration.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think really, as taking a step back as a mental health clinician, for me, what it speaks to is really thinking about mental health very differently in terms of the lifespan, in terms of development, and how can we be preventative if we're going to sort of understand that these kinds of experiences are a little bit more common across adolescence and adulthood.
Sure. So kind of going back to the point you mentioned regarding brain development, I think that's one of the take-home points that I think speaks to the next myth we're going to talk about, which is that adolescence ends at 18 years old.
Yeah.
And this is a myth I wish would disappear quickly.
Right. In fact, Jeffrey Arnett, who again wrote the foreword to our book, he coined the term "emerging adulthood," which really which describes that period really sort of after high school and sort of before a person begins settling down, getting a more permanent job, maybe starting a family, those kinds of things. That myth's really interesting because I actually was the one who primarily wrote that chapter, and as I was thinking about it and sort of this adolescence as a cutoff at 18, I kept going back to the Disney heroines and princesses, where they not only do they become adults before the age of 18, many of them.
Yes, married.
Absolutely, right? So I think about Brave. I think she was 15 or 16.
Sure.
And there are plenty of websites out there that tell you their actual ages.
Sure.
I had no idea how old some of these princesses and heroines were. But here's Brave, for example, who before the age of 18 really matures and becomes very adult-like. The other part to the Disney princesses that I was interested in as I was researching was how this idea of a coming of age occurs almost overnight, and in fact,
day one you're this, and day two you're that.
Right. So, like in the case of Rapunzel, she really becomes an adult overnight.
Right.
And that's not how it works. So, not only does adolescence extend beyond 18, but you don't become an adult overnight, and I think that's really important. But more to the myth, I think there's these societal markers that we once held, like getting married and getting a job that settles you down, and buying a house, and and these things that sort of at one point in our culture's history marked adulthood. Financial independence is a good one. What we're seeing now is that these things are actually extending well beyond the age of 18.
Absolutely.
People are getting married later now, both males and females. People are having children later in life now, both males and females. People are relying on mom and dad for financial independence longer now. I teach a lot of graduate students, and so they tend to be, of course, older students.
Yeah.
And so, they still sort of fall into this category of adolescence if we use those sort of societal markers.
Sure.
Which, again, is why I like the idea of emerging adulthood, perhaps, is a better way to think about it.
I love that, too, because then it's a process.
Right.
Instead of this magical thing that happens. And you do point out in the book that there is a certain physical maturity that happens during teen years. And oftentimes the physical appearance of a person, I think, is also markates them as an adult, which is also unfair.
Absolutely, right. And then even how at least in the United States, for example, you can join the military at 18. You can buy cigarettes at 18. There are these things that sort of mark alcohol 21, but there's these things that sort of mark 18, 19, 20, 21 as, okay, just because you hit that age, you're responsible enough to do these things. And then, we know that individuals vary greatly in many respects.
Yes.
But you brought up a very, very important point, and that is the idea that this is all a process. Adolescence is a process. And sometimes we forget that development is a process.
Yes.
And I think this is one particular myth, I think, that if you ignore, then there can be a lot of disappointment as a parent or as a teenager.
Absolutely.
Right? If you're thinking, well, I should, be financially independent by the time I am a year out of college, and that doesn't happen, then there's disappointment. Or parents who sort of become judgmental, upset, disappointed in their child as they graduate college or as they finish graduate school, and they remain financially dependent.
Right.
So there's some real consequences in terms of perceptions.
And I think there's, a big societal push right now, right, to rid us of stereotypes.
Yeah.
And yet we have really stuck stereotypes for teenagers. And that's a perfect example of one. You went to college, you're supposed to do this, you're supposed to do that. And that's all this, put you in a corner, and that's where you belong.
Right.
And it seems like we could add this to the list of things we can move on from.
Absolutely. And one of the primary goals of our book was to really bust these stereotypes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And have people think about teenagers differently, and with more, like I said before, more empathy.
Yeah, absolutely. So another theme that really came to mind as I was reading your book was actually the phrase, darn kids these days. And I think a lot of the myths speak to how how every generation views the generations that come after it.
Right.
And music certainly is one of those things that every generation thinks the one that came right after them or a couple after them, the stuff they're listening to these days.
Right.
Which is so hilarious, really, if you think about it.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of myths that the book touches on that we'd like to talk about today, which are that a teen's music preference, whether that's rap or rock and roll or things that maybe have a harder edge to them, influence them in particular ways. Right. And the myth that teens are going to benefit from studying while listening to music. So let's talk about both of those. Pick which one you want to start with.
Well, the one about the myth that the type of music you listen to, particularly like rap music or heavy metal music, may cause teens to defy their parents or maybe associated with behavior problems.
Sure.
It's interesting. That myth is, I think you described as sort of generational, and so parents in the 1950s, they said the same thing about rock and roll.
Yeah.
Parents in the 70s 60s said the same thing about folk music, which to me is just really funny about contrasting folk music to rap music.
Sure.
But it was really the themes.
Yes.
The themes of folk music during the 60s was rebellion and really sort of, again, let's fight the establishment because we don't think the establishment is doing anything in our best interest.
Yeah.
In the 70s, it was punk music to some degree, lesser degree, disco. And then the 80s, heavy metal music, the 90s, rap music, and that's carried forward. So it is sort of this generational thing.
Yeah.
The first thing about that myth is we have to be careful about the word cause. So
sure.
The idea that music causes teens to be defiant of their parents or causes behavior problems is a difficult one to make because the research is actually correlational. Meaning we're actually looking at associations, not causal relationships. So what the research does say is that there is an association between the type of music you listen to and behavior problems. So those teens that listen to heavy metal music and rap music are more likely to have behavior problems than those that don't. But the association is very, 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 very small.
Sure.
And we can actually say with a lot of confidence that there's probably a lot of other things that better explain why a kid is having behavior problems.
Sure.
Genetics is one. Temperament and personality is another.
Absolutely.
Peer relationships is another.
Sure.
That explain why kids have behavior problems much better than what music they listen to.
Sure.
The other thing about that is perhaps it's not that the music is causing them to behave badly, but that because they have these behavior problems, they gravitate towards certain musical preferences.
Sure.
And so we have to be very careful about that. The other thing about the research, it's interesting because I actually contributed a lot to that myth as well. I found a study that suggested that teenagers who listen to classical music and jazz music actually report high rates of withdrawn behavior.
Oh, interesting.
So, let's be careful about blaming or really demonizing certain music genres when, the research is sort of all over the place. And I think what that really suggests is that it's a complex question.
Yes.
The relationship music has to maybe how we are behaviorally and emotionally. But as a myth, we can be pretty clear in saying that listening to heavy metal music and rap music does not cause behavior problems, nor does it cause kids to defy their parents.
Right.
The other myth is about listening to music when studying. There's interesting research around that particular myth, and without going into all the details of the types of studies, what we typically find with those studies is that it's, again, really hard to establish causation. So listening to music causes better academic performance or doesn't cause better academic performance. We just can't make those statements. What we can say is that for some people, listening to music is actually doesn't affect their homework performance or their grades if they're studying with music.
It's neutral.
Right.
Sure.
Or for others, it might have an impact. And so in that case, as a parent, I just look at what the outcomes are. My son, for example, was just studying for exams about a week ago. Mm-hmm. And he had his headphones on. And, of course, my attitude was like, what are you doing? Even though I know the myth, right?
Yeah.
He said, well, it helps me study. And I said, well, I don't know about that, but let's see how you do on your exams. And I actually quizzed him on a couple things, and he seemed to do fine. So for him, it didn't impact him one bit. What's interesting for me is if I have any distractions while I'm trying to study something or write, I go off the rails very quickly.
Yes.
So again, I think if we think about that particular idea, that music can enhance performance or not enhance performance, I think we have to think about it in terms of the individual differences that exist.
Sure, absolutely. And that makes a lot of sense, too. Another myth that I think is very interesting, and we briefly touched on it, is that this generation or teens are worse behaved than previous generations. And I think that's a really dangerous myth to perpetuate.
Absolutely.
Because of the expectations it sets up. But tell us more about this myth. I think there's a lot of facets to this that are really interesting.
Yeah, the myth that teens these days are worse behaved than those of previous generations is probably the myth I hear the most. And it really was something in the theme of our book that we wanted to dispel as a whole, like teens these days, right? Kids these days. You said it earlier. If you like look at the media, they clearly portray teens these days in a negative light. Watch an episode of Secret Life of the American Teenager or Pretty Little Liars or Teen Mom, and you'll see that people don't have a very good view of how teenagers today are.
Right.
Public opinion data show that adults believe teenage behavior is worsening. And in fact, people have coined terms to describe how adults are actually afraid of teenagers. It's like this new phobia out there, which seems to me is ridiculous. But if we take an evidence-based perspective, so if we look at the research, what we find is that teens these days are actually not worse behaved than previous generations. In fact, some research suggests that there are declining trends for more serious adolescent problems involving things like delinquency, drug use, and crime. And other research tells us that parents and teachers are actually reporting that today's teens are more socially skilled than in previous generations, happier, and I find this one interesting, volunteer more than teens of previous generations.
Interesting.
I think this myth is perpetuated by the media, but I also think there's some other things that are at play here in terms of us adults and our bias around teenagers. There's a lot of these myths are perpetuated by these sort of cognitive tendencies that we have. One of the cognitive tendencies is to think that correlation means causation.
Sure.
And even if you take a basic research class in psychology, that's one of the things they hammer into you very quickly, is that causation and correlation are very different. But another cognitive tendency is to sort of pay attention to only evidence that supports our viewpoint, while at the same time ignoring evidence that refutes our viewpoint. And I think this myth really is one that draws that out.
Absolutely.
I think that people are more likely, as they believe this myth, they're more likely to remember the disrespectful teenager at the mall than they are to remember the very courteous and helpful teenager who bagged their groceries.
Sure.
Schools, I think, unfortunately get pegged in terms of all the bad things that are happening at schools. It's rare that the national media pulls out stories that really have you believe that teens these days are actually doing a lot of good.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably...
And why aren't we encouraging that?
Right.
Instead of saying, oh, these delinquent teens and all the things they do, like, why would we want to encourage anything like that?
Right,
it's so interesting.
Yeah, you look at headlines across the world, actually, and I did a Google search of headlines, newspaper and news headlines involving teenagers and delinquency, and I mean, there was just pages and pages and pages and pages of stuff describing 3 teens, jump a elderly person outside of a shopping center, or 2 teens plotted to kidnap a teacher, and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
What we don't see as much of is, really heartwarming stories about teenagers volunteering in the community, or something that you do see actually a fair amount of more recently is heartwarming stories of teenagers, high school students that maybe participate in athletics and do something remarkable as far as a character type of building experience. So, allowing maybe a student with disabilities to participate in a sporting event. those kinds of things. We do hear them, and you can go on Facebook and other social media outlets and see those kinds of things. And I really actually am somewhat encouraged by how we pass those things around now, rather than passing around via social media these terrible headlines.
Yes.
So there is a little bit of hope there, but it's still, again, this myth, it perpetuates this stereotype of teenagers as rude and incorrigible, poor attitudes, don't care about school, only care about themselves. That's not necessarily true.
I also think it highlights the way that the way the human mind remembers any particular event in our own life.
Right, absolutely.
Because if I went back and actually thought about my adolescence experience, which, I mean, I was like a ridiculous goody two-shoes, just is what it is, but I certainly didn't make perfect choices all the time, and yet why would I expect like my teenage child to make perfect choices all the time? Right. It's just a very interesting...
Right, and that's something we forget very quickly, right? Yeah. So, the idea that kids are going to make mistakes. Yeah. They're going to make choices that are choices that as we as teenagers also made.
Absolutely.
But as we as adults totally condemn.
Right.
And I think that's... that plays into into the biases as far as our memory and our cognitive tendencies to remember things.
Yes, absolutely. I think the last myth we're going to talk about today, I think, is something that a lot of parents really worry about, and I'm so glad you guys decided to talk about debunking this myth, because as a child does gain physical independence, is spending more time with their friends and those types of things, there's an assumption that there will be a strain on the child-parent relationship.
Right.
And that doesn't come out to be true.
Right.
So tell us more about that.
What we find is that people believe that detachment from parents, so the adolescent process of detachment, involves not just physical detachment, but emotional detachment. And that's, for one, that's not healthy, right? I mean, we want kids to remain attached to their parents. Although, again, someone might think that detaching emotionally is part of the normal developmental process. And again, that's not true. Detachment physically is appropriate, but emotional detachment is not appropriate. And it's actually not common. It's not common for teenagers to detach from their parents emotionally. What I said this earlier, what we find is that parents and teenagers tend to develop a more intimate relationship during the adolescent period. College students report that they may talk less to their parents. That excludes the whole texting thing. That once we introduce that, who knows? But they speak less to their parents on the phone. But they report a better relationship with their parents, and again, a different relationship, a more intimate relationship. And so I think the idea that adolescence is a time of detachment really needs to be focused in on physical detachment, but not emotional detachment. And there's really two examples of that in sitcoms. One sitcom from the 70s, The Brady Bunch. Greg, the oldest brother, he detaches from the family, actually, physically, by moving to the attic. There's a great episode where he moves up to the attic and makes it into this groovy hangout. But he doesn't detach emotionally from the family. And that's emphasized as his parents help him continue to solve problems. A more recent sitcom, Modern Family, the oldest sister, it must be something to do with the oldest kid. The oldest sister, Haley, moves into the basement. Again, she's detaching physically from the family, but if you watch that show, you know that she has a very positive relationship with her parents, one that I would characterize as intimate and appropriate.
A phrase that comes to mind as you're saying these different scenarios is little people, little problems, big people, big problems. And the reason that comes to mind is Like I think about interacting with my toddler or early school age children, and there's tons of communication, but it's about very small items. Could you get me a snack? Could you yada, yada, yada. I think about communication even like through my own college years or even now with my parents, and I'm not talking to them about what I'm making for dinner or whether or not I stopped at the gas station. I'm talking to them about huge, important things, and not every conversation, of course.
Right.
But there's a ton of intimacy in that relationship,
Absolutely.
Even though it's not, we're not in each other's business so
Absolutely.
much.
Right. I mean, we have to be careful. There's the term helicopter parenting.
Sure.
And that can occur at any point in time. You can have an adult child who feels like their parents are helicopter parents, and that generally is not good for development. That tends to not promote emotional independence. Again, that's different than emotional detachment.
Right.
But that tends not to promote emotional independence, which is really important in terms of developing into a healthy adult. But what you're saying is, the relationship does change.
Yeah.
And in that particular myth in the book, under the section What You Need to Know, we talk about that, in that parents of teenagers should expect the relationship to change.
Yes.
Going from maybe, as you're saying, the more sort of day-to-day, mundane interactions and communications to communicating and talking and interacting about different things.
Yeah. And it seems so important to be able to maintain that relationship too. Like, to me, your home should always be a safe zone. And a child should feel like they could say anything. So
absolutely.
Yeah, it seems like a really important transition to be able to make as a parent too, to begin to handle that in an effective way. So well, I'm so glad we had a chance to talk through some of these myths. I think this book is really important work, and you guys should be proud of having put this out in the world. How do you, in a broad scope, hope this kind of affects and people can utilize this in the real world? Yeah,
I think our two primary goals were to dispel commonly held misbeliefs about adolescence. The other was to really do damage to the notion that teenagers these days are sex-starved, hot-headed, addicted to screens, lazy, and egocentric. We were really trying to again, turn the conversation around to, teens these days are actually happy and physically healthy. They are engaging in more volunteer work than teens of any previous generation. So really sort of change that conversation around, but also be more empathic toward teens and more sensitive to what they're having to go through. What we hope for is, again, that society and our culture and parents and educational professionals, mental health professionals, think about teens maybe a little bit differently, and begin to check some of their biases about a developmental period that is filled with lots of stereotypes.
Yeah, absolutely. As if there's not enough already going on for the average teenager.
Right? Yeah, you pile it on, right? Pile it on.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much.
No, thank you.